We're now very happy to be joined by a wonderful woman, Dr. Mira Neshama-Weil, who is a scholar and an expert on Jewish mindfulness, and a Rabbi. Thank you so much for coming to the show, and welcome to our studio.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about start with the concept of Jewish mindfulness. Explain this in your words, how to best explain it.
Yeah. So there is indigenous Jewish mindfulness, and then there's Jewish mindfulness as taking mindfulness, which is a secular meditation tool, and bringing it within Judaism, within a Jewish frame of practice. And I think to understand Jewish mindfulness, we need to do just a little bit of genealogy. Basically, it starts with baby boomers from America, Ashkenaz, who went to Asia to train and to learn Buddhism. They came back, and that was a group of Jews, right? Joseph Goldstein, Charles Salzburg, Jack Kornfield, and Jacqueline Mendel, and they opened the first Insight Meditation Center. And it's basically a process of translation, decontextualizing it from the Buddhist context and bringing it within the Western secular culture first. This is how it started. So they took away the term vipassana, and they called it mindfulness meditation. And then one of their students whose name was John Kabat-Zinn, who was a psychiatrist, he decided to bring mindfulness meditation into care, into therapy for people suffering from chronic disease. And so he took away even the term meditation because it was at the time, it was kind of like edgy. It was kind of ashrami, new agey. So in the kind of scientific, very serious world, you couldn't talk about meditation. So he called it mindfulness. And from there, mindfulness stress reduction became a secular tool that became very legitimate in Western culture. And from there, some rabbis starting practicing mindfulness, that was in the 90s. They started practicing mindfulness meditation, and then they started bringing it within their congregations. And this is how Jewish mindfulness started. So basically, it's a tool, using the tool of mindfulness, which is the art of being present and paying attention within a Jewish context of practice.
Wow. So looking back at kind of our ancients and scholars and rabbis and mystics throughout history, maybe they didn't have a name for it, calling it mindfulness, but back then, did our predecessors engage in mindfulness practices?
I'm really happy you're asking this question, because this is something that people have found out, which is so interesting, that we didn't tend to look at Judaism in this way. But when you look at what we're actually doing, when we're saying brachot, when we're pausing before we drink even a glass of water, this is a mindfulness practice. Right? Yeah. But it's just framed differently, right? In the mindfulness context, it is, I want to appreciate what I'm doing. I want to be fully present. I want to have gratitude also, which is one of the practices in mindfulness, appreciation. And I think in Judaism, because it's kind of coming wrapped as a mitzvah, as a commandment, and taught to you as a kid, like do's and don'ts, and good boy, bad girl. But if you do it as, oh, I want to actually be there, fully present to what I'm doing. So a lot of Jewish practice, Maimonides, actually, we were talking about Maimonides before the show. So Maimonides says that the mitzvot, most of the mitzvot are actually mindfulness trainings, because it teaches us the art of being fully present to everything we're doing.
And I mean, if you're looking back in biblical times and doing all this, we didn't have to put a name to it as mindfulness, because now the world we're living in is crazy. We have to learn to kind of find, each and every one of us, a way to be present, not to place judgment. And it is so true that when things are couched in you have to, it's this holiday, it means you have to do this, it's Yom Kippur, you have to go. But the practice of actually being present is kind of the foundation of these ceremonies, or whatever, ways that we practice these Jewish concepts.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's all about reclaiming it, actually, reclaiming the meaning, really the meaning of what we're doing. And this is like kind of the task of all of us, is to reclaim it, and not just to do it because we're told to do it, but to actually wonder, what does it mean and what does it do? Because when we look at it, there is, and that's what I was starting with when I answered you at first, like there actually is an indigenous Jewish mindfulness, which is kavana, intention, which is so many, pausing, hodaya, gratitude, like these are what we call today in the kind of contemporary jargon, mindfulness practices.
Yes. Welcome back. We're continuing our conversation with Dr. Mira Neshama-Weil, a scholar and expert on Jewish mindfulness. This is all very interesting. And before the break, we were talking about, the 70s and all of these guys that were considered like, it wasn't even rebellion. It was like, okay, we're going to go explore. Also, a lot of people went to India, not just, you know, the Far East. Explain, you think, why in that era there was a search for kind of finding a link between Eastern philosophies to handle the challenges of life that maybe weren't found in Judaism specifically?
Yeah. You know, this era is called the counterculture, and I think it's called this way because it really was, for that whole generation of baby boomers, the end of what we call the culture of Western modernity. The culture of Western modernity was built on the premise that if, you know, humanity was going more and more towards technological progress, we would bring happiness to the world, basically. You know, equality, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and, you know, peace in the world. And what we saw was just the opposite. You know, what we saw in the first half of the 20th century, the two most murderous world war with like mass murder, you know, done thanks to technology. And then the two main ideologies, which were fascism and communism, and we saw the demise of it and how destructive they were. And so people who emerged from that after World War II with the atomic bomb and with the Shoah, and they were completely disillusioned with Western modernity, with that dream of enlightenment, right? Especially because the problem came from nations and people who are the most educated and supposedly the most enlightened, right? And then they became massive. There actually is a lot of literature written about this that's called the turn east, like a new Orientalism, really turning towards other models of thinking the world and thinking a place in the world. And so Eastern spiritualities, right, which were offering a very different model, at least in our Western projections, right, where it was not about so much about achieving and going, but more about contemplating and pausing and stopping. So there was this huge like rush towards all the ashrams in India, as you said, and in Japan and Thailand and places like this, really in search for solace.
Especially after, like you said, the Shoah, I mean, the baby boomer, I mean, there are also, you know, a link to obviously that time and that generation now is older. You're seeing a lot of them went in the counterculture. Now a lot of them have become kind of very conservative. But explain, because I know you've done your PhD thesis and you've written a lot of papers. Explain kind of where Judaism and Buddhism specifically, where they meet, how are they integrated, and how do they fit together?
Now, Judaism and Buddhism tended to be described as opposites, and in some levels they are, right? Buddhism, the ideal of Buddhism on the paper is to be a monastic, a renunciant, to be a contemplative. The ideal of Judaism is to be, you know, to found a family and to be engaged in the world. Now, if you look at the Jewish mysticism, if you look at the mystique, they actually really, really meet each other deeply. In Buddhism, there is this notion of peeling the onions, so peeling the layers of your ego, really, to find the kind of a place of a nirvana, which is not ecstasy. Nirvana is the extinction of the self. In Jewish mysticism, you have actually a very similar notion, which we call bitul hayesh, which is extinction of the self. And it's very similar to you know, peeling the onion. We call it itpashtut, like kind of undressing the self, the klipot, taking away the klipot. So the mystiques are very, very similar, but there is something where they really differ is the Jewish engagement in the world. And I find that for Jews, there was less tension, there was less kind of, tension about going into Buddhism, and yet at some point they found this place of, you know, what do I do with my Jewish roots and my, you know, so it was both easier and also brought some tension because of that.
Right, right. Also, the interesting thing about Buddhism, we know it's looking at kind of how everything is connected, you know, how, you know, the plant world, I'm looking at a video here and a woman spinning around, you know, the plant world, the animal world, the insect world. I mean, we study this in Kabbalah and it's written about in the Zohar, but the Buddhist practice kind of really kind of hones in on that. So why, in a way, it's not a conflict of interest in today's terms. There's a lot of people that claim, I'm a Jew, and I follow a Buddhist way of life. So would you say Buddhism is more of a way of life and a way of looking at the world, less a religion because religion then becomes dogmatic at times?
I think it's a very good question, and I think we have to keep in mind that when we talk about Buddhism, we talk about the Buddhism that in a way was fed to the Westerners. Buddhism in Asia is very different. It looks very much more like a religion. People bring offerings, people pray to the Buddha, right? The Buddhism we got was stripped away from all these kind of ritualistic and, you know, religious and cultural elements, and just giving us exactly what we need, which in a way looks more like a therapy and like inquiry. So that's very appealing, and that, as you said very rightly, is a way of life. Judaism is also complex in its way because it can be a religion, but it's first and foremost an identity, right? You're born Jewish, supposedly, right? This is how it works. It's a culture, it's a belonging, it's a history, it's a society, and you can be very Jewish and very unreligious also, right? That being said, like, I think a lot of Jews feel kind of pushed away, turned away by what they see as traditional Judaism because, and we mentioned it earlier, but because of the whole like kind of like packaging of obligations. And I think actually we have a problem, if I may say it this way, of PR, which is a problem actually of education, including, and excuse me for saying it this way, the way traditional Jewish education works. And this is starting to change. It's starting to change because rabbis and teachers, educators are starting to understand that people need meaning. If you don't have meaning in what you do.
Mira, thank you so much for your insight. I look forward to having an opportunity to interview you again.
Thanks for having me.
Much appreciated, and have a beautiful week.
You too, Emily.